So in my world, one of Charles Reich's most important legacies is his connection to the modern welfare rights movement and the field of poverty law. So he was part of this amazing cohort of thinkers and advocates and activists who made that field of law visible and legitimate. And I would say his contribution was largely that of a visionary, someone who could see across the legal and political landscape and find a language to capture what he saw. So of those publications that centered on poverty and social welfare, a canonical one, of course, is one that we've been talking a lot about, The New Property, famously invoked in Goldberg versus Kelly. Those in this room, though, might also remember Midnight Welfare Searches and the Social Security Act, published in 1963. Also, as Jillian Metzger mentioned, Individual Rights and Social Welfare, the Emerging Legal Issues, published 2 years later. So here's my question. So how did Reich, with his relatively privileged upbringing, his elite education, how did he come to learn and care about the legal and bureaucratic difficulties of welfare recipients? So, right, he goes straight from the upper echelons, of legal practice in DC to a professorship at Yale Law School. When would he have had time to educate himself at the kind of these very granular details? Now, as we think about the themes of the New Property, as others have mentioned, it's pretty obvious from Reich's biography where some of this is coming from, right? So we can tell why he might have cared about government persecution, for example. So plenty of his mentors, his friends, were the target of loyalty security investigations in the 1940s and 50s. And one need only recall the timing of his Supreme Court clerkship, as others have mentioned, in 1954, the tail end of McCarthyism, to see why he had thought about the significance of things like government-issued licenses and clearances and passports, and what it meant to have those things taken away. And then, of course, from other biographical details, we gather that he had this affinity for people who were outsiders, who were underdogs. He felt himself that way, and for people who are therefore especially vulnerable to state power. But again, welfare mothers, I would say, were not, as far as I know, part of his social set, right? And they weren't part of the Supreme Court's docket in 1954. So how did he gain the knowledge necessary to write these insightful, empathetic, important articles? So here, what I'm going to do in this presentation is I'm going to talk about two people who I think were very influential for him. So two older women in Reich's life who were plugged into these worlds of social welfare and public income support. And those two are Justine Wise Polier, who is this famous New York family court judge and the mother of one of Reich's childhood friends, and Elizabeth Wickenden, who is a close friend of Justine Wise Polier's and gets to know Reich in that way. And she's a well-known figure in the world of New Deal reform. So again, some great synergies here. And I would say the two of them together would decisively affect his research agenda. They would also help forge these links that we've been talking about between sort of the old left and the new left. So I'm going to tell you briefly about these two women who I think are remarkable figures in their own right. So Justine Wise Polier, she is best known for her work as a family court judge. She's this incredible child welfare, juvenile justice reformer. She's also part of this very esteemed left-wing family. So her father is a man named Rabbi Stephen Wise, who made a name for himself by kind of notoriously rebelling against New York's elite Jewish community and setting out for himself. He starts his own synagogue. He uses his position to advocate for workers, immigrants, the poor. He's always insisting that his pulpit free speech will reign. In other words, he doesn't want his message to ever be dictated to by kind of the elite and powerful interests. He's one of the founders of the American Jewish Congress and the NAACP. He has a close friendship with FDR. And when you read Justine Wise Polier's biography, she has an oral history actually, it's kind of like watching this parade of progressive figures kind of walk through her life. So, there's Booker T. Washington, who's coming over for dinner at her father's house, and there's former President Taft reading to her while she has the chicken pox. I mean, you can kind of get the picture here of the circles she traveled in. All right, so as a young adult then, Polier, she receives a fine education. You know, she goes to institutions like Radcliffe, like Barnard. She also worked in settlement houses and embedded herself in factories. She spent a summer at the UN's International Labor Organization trying to study up on trade unions. Barely out of college, she had been flagged as a potential subversive, and this is actually why she goes to law school. She goes to Yale in 1925, and it's because her father sort of gently suggests, you know, that if you're going to keep getting in trouble, you might as well learn something about the law to kind of help yourself out of these scrapes. So she goes to Yale. She excels at Yale, and she does so despite spending what I think was pretty much the bulk of her time supporting a textile strike in Passaic, New Jersey. But in any case, at that time, you could apparently still do quite well at Yale while supporting a textile workers' strike in another state. All right, so after graduation, this is the eve of the Depression, and this is coinciding also with the birth of Charles Reich. So I would describe her career now as sort of that of a New Deal lawyer, although she's always in New York rather than D.C. So she turns to social legislation. She, from 1929 to 1934, she works as a referee in the State Workers' Compensation Division of the New York State Department of Labor. So this previously had been the kind of position that you give to like a political hack, but she treated it very, very seriously. She uses it to call for reform. The Depression deepens. She's appointed to a very important kind of local committee that the mayor had created to decide what to do about unemployment relief. And then in 1935, she begins working for the city as assistant corporation counsel and becomes kind of deeply enmeshed in, again, the local response to the Great Depression. And then there's this next phase of her career where I'd say she becomes very intimately familiar with the kind of problems that she will then talk to Charles Reich about. And this phase is when she becomes, she's appointed to a position on New York City's Domestic Relations Court. So that's the title then. Today we'd call that Family Court. She holds this post until 1973. And here's something that she said about what she saw day to day. This is words from, she's being interviewed in 1980. She says, "I was always horrified by what happened to people in the welfare system, the school system, the hospital system, the state institution system." In other words, she is both kind of part of this social welfare bureaucracy, and she is seeing and appreciating every day the kind of darker side of this system. In the evenings, meanwhile, Polier kind of works a second shift, not at home actually, but in a number of auxiliary groups, so all devoted to issues of social justice, and many overlap with the work of her husband, Shad Polier, who himself is this very well known at the time civil rights and civil liberties lawyer. So Reich would have come to know the Poliers in this period, so the late 1930s, the early 1940s, through one of their sons. By the time Reich was 12, he told historian Martha Davis, he and Justine Wise Polier would debate current events as if I was an adult. And this friendship, right, became a lifelong friendship. He refers to her as Bobsy in these handwritten letters he sends her throughout his life. And this friendship would eventually open up others for Reich, including to this other figure that I'll briefly tell you about, this figure named Elizabeth Wickenden. So Elizabeth Wickenden, I think the best way to think about her is, again, as kind of one of these stalwart New Dealers. She, like so many things that go on to influence the New Deal, was actually born in Madison, Wisconsin. And some of that kind of progressive social scientific ethos seems to just kind of seep into her bones. So her family moves away from Madison. They're following the career of her father, who's an engineering professor, but nonetheless, this kind of ethos sticks with her. So she goes on to get degrees in economics and sociology at Vassar. And then she goes on to various posts in New Deal administration. So she's in Harry Hopkins' famous or infamous, depending on your views, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. She's then in the Works Progress Administration, the National Youth Administration, right? So she's like in this alphabet soup very deeply. And the friendships and relationships that she cultivates in these years go on to be very important in her life going forward. So, of course, some of these relationships prove dangerous to her, right? So she is on the radar of the government loyalty security apparatus, like so many New Dealers. But other relationships make her very powerful for years to come. So it's this time that she and her husband is named Arthur Goldschmidt, they become very close friends with Abe Fortas and his wife Carol. She befriends future President Lyndon Johnson. And then at this time, so this is kind of the 40s, she's transitioning to a career as a Washington-based consultant for various social welfare, public welfare groups. And she starts developing these really close friendships with people who are very, very high up in the Social Security Administration. So Wilbur Cohen, Arthur Altmeyer, people who are, at the very most senior levels of policymaking. And by the 1950s, she's basically in regular correspondence with these guys, talking about how to protect and expand the best aspects of the New Deal's social welfare apparatus. And it's in fact these contacts with these federal administrators that first get her thinking about the legal and constitutional rights of welfare recipients, and that in turn inspired her contacts later on with Charles Reich. So to kind of set the stage for that, for this kind of next phase of talking about the Reich connection, I need to paint for you briefly this picture about what the welfare state looked like in the US in the 1950s. So these were actually really great years for some programs. So Social Security, for example, that's thriving, but very hard years for other programs. And one program in particular was very hard hit. So that's the program that we now think of as welfare. So basically it's a federally subsidized, state-run program of need-based income support for mothers and children. So at the time it was called Aid to Dependent Families. And that program basically, this history is necessary to understand the backlash. So it grows initially out of progressive era, what were called mothers' pensions programs. And these were programs that were basically aimed at the most deserving mothers. So imagine, this, a white widow whose husband has died or has abandoned her and left her with young children to care for. So mothers' pensions were originally aimed at that kind of person. So what happens though during the New Deal and in response to federal incentives is that those kind of programs grow and they expand. And for the first time, the federal government sets some of the ground rules. So the programs remained actually quite restrictive, but at the same time, plenty of people were able to get on the rolls that had never been on the rolls before. And at the same time, so other pieces of the New Deal welfare state are expanding in ways that basically pluck from aid to dependent families the most deserving beneficiaries, right? So for example, Social Security is expanding in ways that's going to capture those white widows, and it's leaving behind other people. So you can imagine kind of the demographics shifting here in ways that critics are going to seize on. So the critics look at this program and they say more and more, this looks like a program that is supporting non-white and never married mothers, and say illegitimate children is a phrase that starts to get thrown around at this time. It's a program that they say is supporting these kind of immoral relationships, again, that are coded as non-white. All right, so the response by many state legislatures, and this is getting to the kinds of things that Wickenden and Polier and then later Reich are going to get very upset about. This response by state legislatures at this time is to make that program of aid to dependent children, to make it harder to get and harder to keep. And they do this in various ways. So one way that they do it is to impose what we would now call work requirements on people who are applying. In other words, if you want benefits, you have to agree to do some work, low-wage work. Another response was to say, if you want benefits, you have to file criminal non-support charges against the father of your children. The situation that became really the pivot point in Elizabeth Wickenden's career occurred in Louisiana. And what Louisiana and other places did, so this is a technique that was pioneered in Mississippi, and Louisiana kind of pushes it even further, is they amend their state aid to dependent children law to say any woman who has had a child out of wedlock after receiving a check from the welfare department, she can't receive benefits anymore until she proves to us that she has ceased illicit relationships and is maintaining a suitable home for the child. And that's a law enacted in that same legislative session would deny benefits to other so-called illegitimate children, right, if there were others in the family. In other words, so it's a very far-reaching law, and in addition, the state attorney general gives it retroactive effect. And what this means, so pretty much immediately, something like 22,500 children lose their benefits, again, pretty much all at once, and 98% of them are African American, right? So you can imagine the response to this. The response is, outrage by community groups, by local civil rights organizations, and that in turn gets the attention of these more kind of national level folks, including Elizabeth Wickenden, including Justine Wise Polier, and including her lawyer husband, Shad Polier. So what happens at this point, some people go on these kind of media campaigns, other people are lobbying President Eisenhower, but what Wickenden and the Poliers decide to do is go after the agency, basically. So the agency that ostensibly could do something about this is the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. So this is an agency where Wickenden has a lot of contacts and a lot of pals, but it's also a useful target because this agency has the statutory authority to cut off Louisiana's federal welfare funds to the tune of about $22 million, right? So they could really do something to say, these practices are wrong. Now, in practice, that kind of funding cutoff that I've just described to you, that's actually very rare. So an HEW administrator once described that to me as like the nuclear option. It's something that's basically not done. But you could still use it to kind of put pressure on the state. And so that's something that they succeed in getting done. So HEW convenes this formal hearing to decide whether they should cut off Louisiana's federal funds. And as part of that hearing, so here's kind of the interesting legal constitutional point, they invite or they accept friend of the court type briefs. So this is an agency hearing, but they're kind of inviting people to submit amicus briefs, including, and the parties that do this are the ACLU, the Child Welfare League of America, the National Urban League, and the Family Services Association. And this matters because these are all groups that Wickenden and the Poliers are kind of enmeshed with, and Wickenden plays this role of kind of quarterbacking the effort. So she's in touch with the key players, and she's making sure they share knowledge and resources. So the outcome of the Louisiana episode is kind of a separate and interesting conversation. I would say what matters for our purposes is that it kind of, it sparks something in Elizabeth Wickenden. So recall, she is somebody who for a long time has kind of focused on policy making and on Congress. And now all of a sudden she's seeing the potential of going through legal process and claims about legal rights. She's starting to think, okay, the time is right actually for this kind of tool rather than the other tool. And so what she does then going forward from Louisiana is she makes herself a kind of clearinghouse for all sorts of reports about state and local infringements on the rights of welfare recipients. As well as for reports, and these are kind of still very scattered in the early 1960s, about people using the courts to push back. And because of her long career in public welfare, she's kind of a magnet for this information, right? People know who she is, and they're sending her stuff, and she's aggregating it. And she's not trained as a lawyer, but she's really starting to try to educate herself on, what are the legal lines and constitutional lines of attack here. And it's really in this context. So she's trying to put together these legal ideas. She's not trained as a lawyer. She wants to test her ideas, that she starts reaching out to Charles Reich. So Reich, recall, at that point is a friend of her friend, and he becomes her go-to resource. So in one letter, she describes him as her court of last resort on welfare law issues. That's October 1964. So the first piece of correspondence I found from them is August 30th, 1962. Reich thanks Wickenden for sending him her thoughts on the public welfare amendments of 1962. And so these amendments are kind of interesting because the Kennedy administration is touting them as, it's sort of like the new frontier for public welfare. They're touting this as this, this kind of great liberal advancement. But Wickenden, meanwhile, again, because she's kind of alert now to this, these legal and constitutional issues, she's kind of worried about some provisions that are more in the nature of fine print. So, for example, she notices a provision that basically says, if a state or local administrator, thinks that maybe a welfare mother isn't spending her payments in the best interest of the child, then it would be fair to impose on her counseling and guidance and even civil and criminal penalties. So she's writing to Reich to kind of basically say, is this fishy, like this doesn't seem right to me. And he writes back to her affirming that, yeah, that seems, deeply problematic. And he also flags for her, a potential due process argument if someone were to actually be prosecuted for this crime of not spending her welfare payments properly. And recall again, so if we're gonna place this in the kind of grand narrative about Reich's work, I just want to remind you what he's working on at this moment, right? So he is not yet writing about the plight of welfare recipients. He is, of course, deeply concerned about the relationship between the state and the individual, but his main examples are coming from different spheres, right? So in August of 1962, when he had just had this exchange with Wickenden, his most recent article was this California Law Review piece that was mentioned earlier on the public and the nation's forests. Guido had mentioned that at this time he was probably already working on the new property, but he was also working on this Harvard Law Review essay on Justice Black, right? So again, my point is he's learning at this moment about public welfare. It's not exactly on his radar. All right, so Wickenden corresponds with Reich again in early 1963 regarding a memo that she has written that she calls Poverty and the Law. And this memo, and he gives it his stamp of approval, it essentially synthesized all the information that she had gathered so far about infringements on recipients' statutory and constitutional rights. So it describes things like, mothers in New Jersey whose applications for welfare would trigger these rarely enforced adultery and fornication laws that were still on the books, right? Sort of a selective prosecution of them. A mother in Connecticut who had been sent back, basically deported to another state after seeking welfare for a supposedly illegitimate child. And in many jurisdictions, and here we're moving towards the midnight raids, this practice of local authorities basically searching the homes of welfare recipients late at night to search for a, quote, man in the house. That is a male figure who is enjoying sexual access to the woman while offloading his financial responsibilities onto the state, right? That is the ostensible argument for why this was appropriate. So the goal of the memo at that time, Wickenden said, was for to encourage lawyers and other interested people to maybe attack some of these practices in court. Again, she's not a lawyer, she can't do this, but she's encouraging other people to think about it. She also had another target, which was federal agency officials. So she wants her friends in HEW to see the legal and constitutional problems with those practices and use their leverage, essentially their power of the purse, to pressure offending state and local governments. And both of these targets are apparent in what happens next. So basically, Wickenden and the Poliers commission Reich to write about midnight raids, right? So he writes a memo for them. They get funding for him. Obviously, the money is not the only reason that he does it. And that memo, in turn, becomes the article that you know as the Midnight Welfare Raids article, right? And in turn is going to inform the new property. So, I think you all know where this is headed next. I'll just close by saying, what is the point of excavating this backstory? And I want to make really clear that the point is not to take glory, right, away from Reich or to diminish his accomplishments. To the contrary, I hope I'm memorializing him in a way that he would really appreciate. So as others have mentioned, a theme that comes through in his writings about himself is this sense of loneliness, of detachment, of disconnection, yearning for fellowship, right? A sadness at the elusiveness of that. And so my point today is that behind Reich's greatest work actually was connection and friendship and solidarity across generations and gender and disciplinary lines. So I think we really honor him as an individual when we remember how he was connected to others. Thank you.